Good morning, everyone. I know that 10 o'clock is very early for most young people. It's quite late for elderly persons, but I will try to keep you awake during the class. The objective of my lecture is to explain to you a little bit of the relationship, this very ambivalent, problematic relationship between Greece and the European project. I had chosen this title many years ago and nobody understood it, and now I found out that people know it because somehow it became trendy in TikTok. But do you know where it comes from and what it means, as a matter of fact? It's French. So does anyone know what's the background of this title?
They are too young.
No, they told me.
I love you, but not anymore.
I love you.
Me neither.
Me neither. And it comes from a song of the 1960s, which was a sort of scandalous song in France in that period. And it was intended to denote this kind of frustration of love. People love each other and they don't love each other. And this is quite useful in order to understand how Greece and the EU tend to behave to each other. Now, what I want to give you is I don't know how many of you are familiar with the history of Greece, maybe the modern history of Greece. What I want to give you is a little bit of how Greece joined the European Economic Community, the European Union at the time. What were the implications? How the relationship between the two sides was always a bit tense, and how this tension increased during the period of the economic crisis at the end of the first decade of 2000, from 2010 to 2015, and also to give you a basis to be able to analyze how Greece can play a role in the institutional framework of Europe. Now, some notions of history. The terms Europe and Asia are coming, like most things in the history of humanity, from Greece. So Europe was the West, Asia was the East. But for Greeks who coined the terms, I mean they didn't coin it, they came from Phoenicians, but Greeks transported it into Western civilization, let's say. For Greeks, Europe was on the west of Greece, and Asia was on the east of Greece. For most Greeks, Europe was something different, not unlike the way British see Europe. We are part of Europe, but we are not really part of Europe. So, from the beginning, the relationship between Greece and what we generally term the West was always very unclear and also lacking basic confidence. I want to give you some pictures. I don't know how many of you, there are some there are some Greek students and some students from Serbia. They may be aware of what we see here. Does anyone know what this is? Nobody. This is the depiction of what was called the Great Schism. The Great Schism between the Catholic and the Orthodox Christianity in the 9th century. Basically this is the 11th century, but it started from the 9th century. The first thing that we have to bear in mind is that for Greeks, the West was a heretic world. A world which was not totally Greek. And as such, they were looking at the West with misgivings, with lack of trust. This lack of trust was reinforced in the 13th century. Does this ring a bell to someone? What is that? What do you see?
Crusade, Fourth Crusade of Babylon.
That's the Fourth Crusade. Very ancient history for most of you who are doing international relations. What does anyone know about the Fourth Crusade? Yeah, go ahead.
So essentially the Crusaders wanted to go to Jerusalem, but they needed ships, and Venice was like a dandolo, it was like, well, we can't ships, but you need to pay us. And the Crusaders said, sure, we can pay you by raiding, for example, Zara. And then the Venetians were like, what about Constantinople? So all of the great Christians all of a sudden turned against the Christian Byzantine Empire and raided the Constantinople. Created that.
Precisely. The Fourth Crusade, instead of going to conquer Jerusalem, conquered the Byzantine Empire and sealed a period of total mistrust between Greece, the Byzantine Greece, and the West. In the 15th century, already from the 14th century, but in the 15th century, the Byzantine Empire was threatened by the Ottoman invasions, which started in Asia Minor and were closing into Constantinople. At that time, Greece was divided, the Byzantine Empire, rather, but Greeks in the Byzantine Empire were divided between those who said that we have to work with the West, with the Catholics, in order to defend the Byzantine integrity, and those who said we have to prevent the West from coming to conquer our ideals, our world, and it's better to stick with the Ottomans. So already from the 15th century there was a division in Greece between those who saw Greece as more akin to Asia and those who saw Greece as a part of the West. The division between pro-Westerners and pro-Easterners, if you want, persists today. At the same time, though, that Greece was torn between pro and anti-Westerners, it was also very much depending on the West. When Greece became independent in the beginning of the 19th century, when there was a revolution against the Ottoman Empire and part of Greece became independent. It became independent basically through the intervention of the West. The revolution was more or less suppressed, and gradually the Ottoman Empire was taking over the liberated areas of Greece, and the Western powers, in a very famous naval battle in the Peloponnese, defeated the Ottoman fleet and forced the introduction of a free, independent Greek state onto the Ottoman Empire. So, from the beginning of modern history, Greece was depending to a large extent on a West which for Greeks was at the same time the bearer of modernism. Modernism came from the West. This is a typical, how to put it, a typical cartoon from the early 19th century. And you see the Greek society, it says the Greek society, the parents, the younger people. the parents dressed in traditional Oriental Balkan dresses, the new society dressed like the West. So the West for Greece was at the same time a scaremonger, they were afraid of the West, and the bearer of modernism. This is an ambivalence, and this ambivalence is characterizing the history of Greece and the relations of Greeks with the West even today. Now, I'm not going to give you a long history of Greece. After the Second World War, Greece went through a civil war, and in the 50s and 60s tried to modernize itself. And in order to modernize itself, it looked towards the West. This was also assisted by the fact that the world after the Second World War was divided between East and West. Greece belonged to the Western part, was a member of NATO, depending very much on the United States, and therefore Greece became part of the West, and its relationship with the other side, be it Balkans, which is the geographical focus of Greece, or the East, was very much lost. So from the 1950s, Greece became a Western country. In the end of the 1960s, Greece had the last case of military rule between 1967 and 1974, and after 1974, Greece tried to integrate the institutions of the West. First and foremost, the European Economic Community. When I talk about the European Economic Community, we know what we're talking about. Do we? What is the European Economic Community called today? Good. Yes. So it's safe to know what it is. So, after 1974, Greece, especially the then Prime Minister of Greece, had a focus on making Greece a normal country, which was not the case before 67, because before 67, Greece was an imperfect democratic system, the Communist Party was banned, there were discrimination between persons who belonged to the left and to the right, so there were non-republican elements who were governing in part, like the crown, the army. So after 1974, the objective of the government was to make Greece a full democracy, and in order to do that, to integrate Greece into the European project. Greece was part of the European project even earlier because it had an association agreement with the European Economic Community since 1961. But the association agreement was very much an economic, let's say, had an economic approach, basically liberating trade between the two sides. Instead, the European Economic Community accession, like in other countries of the Mediterranean later on, Spain and Portugal, was mostly a political project. The objective of joining the European Economic Community was mostly to guarantee that the country would remain a full democracy, that there would be no other dictatorship, there would be no military interventions. So that was a really modernist project in Greece. It was not, however, a modernist project that was not followed by a part of the population. This is, for instance, one reason why Greece did not have a referendum to join the European Economic Community. Because the government which was challenged in joining the European Economic Community, even within its own ranks, was afraid that the referendum might give a negative answer. So the membership of the European Economic Community was ratified through parliamentary acceptance. And to a large extent, it was seen by the elite as an effort to embed democratic institutions, and by the people as a means to increase prosperity. The main objective that the government was saying is, when we joined the European Economic Community, was Greece will cease to be poor. Greece was a poor country. I mean, up till the 1960s, 70s, Greece had emigration. People left because they wanted to get it, I mean, they wanted to go somewhere to find a job. The economic situation of the country was mostly a pre-modern one. We had a very limited industrial basis, and to a large extent the country was an agricultural economy, even in the 1960s. So to a large extent, accession to the European project was a project to modernize Greece. But this was not very much adhered to by the population. Because again, what we call the Greek dualism, the incapacity or the ambivalence of Greeks to live, to accept whether they are part of the West or whether they are part of a separate entity, continued. And these are the two main personalities of the 1970s and 80s, the Prime Minister and then President, conservative Karamanlis, and the Prime Minister, the Socialist Prime Minister, Papandreou. The two, let's say, the two phrases that embodied very much this division was Greece belongs to the West. That was a very famous saying by the Prime Minister when he explained the reasons for Greece's joining a membership of the EEC. And Greece belongs to the Greeks, which was the opposition, let's say, phrase that became a catchphrase by later on Prime Minister Papandreou. To a large extent, Greece joined the European Economic Community in 1981. But to a large extent, what Greece met was a different process of decisions and a different process of negotiations that Greeks knew at the time. I have to say that Greece, as most Balkan countries, has been and still is to a large extent a very centralized country. Decisions are taken in the capital. We are a very legalistic society. We legislate about everything. We don't enforce what we legislate, but we legislate about everything. And at the same time, there is a very rigid hierarchy of norms. In the end, the Prime Minister or the leader, in fact, takes all decisions. When Greeks went to Brussels, they met another system of decision making. First of all, because of its history, Greece could not understand the basic reason of European integration. What is the basic reason in the 1950s of European integration? Which was the reason that European integration started? In the very beginning. Economic. Peace. Avoiding another war. And this made sense for Germans and Belgians and Italians and French. In Greece, the traditional enemies were elsewhere. Austerity. They were Bulgaria, the Balkans. So the element of peace was not present when Greeks joined the EC. We joined the EC, but we wanted peace, but it was a more generic feeling, peace in the world, peace for us, but not peace with our neighbors, because our neighbors were not in the EC. Were not even contemplating to be in the EC. They belonged to another camp, the communist camp, to some extent. The second element that was lacking when Greece joined was the concept of consensus. When the European integration was built, one basic characteristic of this integration was that we give away part of our sovereignty. This is what we call supranationalism. For Greeks, for the Greek elite in particular, giving away part of the sovereignty was almost treason, because decisions had to be taken at national level, and especially at the level of the leader. So, the Greeks did not have the traditional way to understand how the European process worked. And, in particular, because of the position, when Greece joined, geography is important. Greece was, do you know when Greece joined the European Economic Community? 81. So that was the 10th member. The furthest away capital of a member state at the time was Dublin, which was 1.5 hours flight from Brussels. Athens was 3 hours flight from Brussels, so it was further away. There was the nearest member state, which was Italy, was divided by sea. So traditional commercial links were not, how to put it, were not shaped under geography. They were shaped under pre-existing economic links with Germany. In terms of economy with Germany, in terms of education with Britain, in terms of civilization, of culture with France. So for Greece, membership membership of the European Economic Community did not lead to a change of pattern of decision making. Decision making in Greece remained a very hierarchically vertical process, and Greeks could not understand the fact that regions were involved in decision making. That you have to give in something in order to get something else. As Greeks are Southerners and they are Balkans, and therefore they have the tendency of ownership of what they believe, and when they don't implement what they believe, they think that there is something lost. They don't understand the concept of the win-win, that I give something which will demean what I have, but will increase what we have collectively. So giving away something for the Greek leadership was a loss. And there was no capacity to understand how this will improve the prosperity of everyone. So Greeks maintained an approach. Once they joined the EC, they maintained an approach. Let's get what we want. Let's claim what we want. If we get them, fine. If we don't get them, they hate us. And we don't intervene on matters that are not of direct interest to us. We only intervene on matters which affect us particularly. This is a good process in an international negotiation system. This is not a good way to deal when you are in a process of common building of supranational decision making. So from the very beginning, Greeks were feeling a little bit aloof in the system of decision-making in Greece. So they preferred to continue having their own traditional, bilateral, and unequal relationship with the countries that had, for a long time, a role in the European, in the Greek, in relations with Greece, like France and like Britain in particular. Greece joined in 1981, and it was the same year that the Socialist Party, which was a radical socialist party at the time, came to power. Now, the Socialist Party, in Greek it's called PASOK, was a rather awkward-looking socialist party, nothing to do with the Spanish or the French Socialist Party. It was much more third world oriented, and it had a very negative stance towards the Western institutions. I remind you what I wrote earlier: Greece belongs to Greeks, and therefore if Greece belongs to Greeks, why should Germans or Italians decide about Greece? So initially, PASOK came to power saying we'll renegotiate EC membership. Luckily for PASOK and for Greece, the benefits of integration started coming in the very beginning of PASOK's government. So in the first years of Greece's membership, Greece started receiving European funds, regional funds, structural funds, agricultural funds. And these funds were managed and distributed by the government. As a result, the government quickly changed its mind. They said, yeah, Europe is good. We get some money. We can have a way there, because gradually they start understanding how the system works. And from 1984 onwards, PASOK was one of the most pro-European parties in Greece. This led to what one could call a marriage of convenience. Greece was small, and because of the fact that Greece was small, it was not affecting significantly the European balance of powers. There were few Greeks who emigrated, so there was no immigration threat. The funding that came to Greece was significant for Greece, but relatively minor for the EC. Italy got much more, France got much more, so it was not, we were not affecting the general balance of powers. And Greece, with this membership, became a prosperous country for the first time in its, I don't know, since the ancient times. So, European integration was extremely beneficial for Greece in the 1980s and in the 1990s. For direct funding, but also because of the fact that it opened up the country into what we could call the Western system of decision-making. And in fact, in the 1990s, Greeks were the most pro-European nation in Europe. There was a degree of acceptance of the European project of about 80 to 85%. So everybody was happy. But the fact that Greece, or the fact that Greeks understood Europe as a milking cow, meant that the political aspect of integration was missing, or was missing for the citizens, or for most of the citizens. Greece was not seen as a project of peace, as I told you, because it did not affect Greek peace. I mean, we continued, for instance, Greece during all that time continued having tense relations with its neighbors, especially with Turkey. Problems, especially after the 1990s, with its northern neighbors. So the element of peace as an element of, as a constituent element of integration was not there. But because of the fact that there was also lacking the political notion of federalism, let's say, of building a pre-federal state, for Greeks, for most Greeks, Europe was an economic enterprise, which was beneficial. So we were happy. They were happy, we were happy. It did not change very much the way things were organized in Greece. Decisions were still taken on at the level of central government. We introduced regionalism because we had to introduce regions in order to benefit better from the structural funds. But regional governments still, to a large extent, did not allow to change the model of decision making in the country. The decision, everyone still looks today, still looks to Athens for decisions. Despite the fact that even today regional administration has significant powers, but the money comes from the center, and therefore guidance comes from the center. The fact that we were not able to understand the concept of pooling sovereignties, you understand what pooling sovereignty means? The term in English. You know what that means? To bring together, to share. So the absence of being able to understand what pooling of sovereignties meant implied that for most Greeks, Europe was coming through the government. So decisions, and I mean, this is something that we see a lot in other states as well. Decisions that are taking place, that have been made in Brussels, if they are beneficial, they come as victories of the government. Decisions that are taken in Brussels and create sort of harm to individuals are promoted as forced upon the government by Brussels. So, to a large extent, Europe was seen by the Greeks from the national lens. The government was sort of channeling European feeling. And at the same time, there were the political differences within the parties. Greece, although it became a stable democracy, still had a strong element of polarization within the country. And the absence of consensus between parties on what is our role in the EU meant that for citizens, Europe was seen mostly as an economic process. This starts to change with the Eurozone crisis after 2008. I don't know how many of you, you were children with this, or you were not even born, I don't want to ask. You were born in 2008, weren't you? Yes, okay. Lovely. Anyway, you were in elementary or high school. But the Eurozone crisis was a global crisis that started in the United States. It was initially a crisis that was linked to what we call subprime loans, to investments in inequalities in the United States, but because of globalization, it passed on to the rest of the world, and it reached the Eurozone. I open a parenthesis. In the beginning, in the end of the 1990s, the European Union the European Economic Community became the European Union and started the process of building a common currency. That was the only time that Greece decided that it was significant to join the common currency and undertook a number of measures, usually austerity measures, to build the infrastructure, the economic infrastructure, the capacity to join the common currency. And it succeeded. So, but it still, it succeeded in the sense that it managed to fulfill the criteria that were set for joining the common currency. There were many problems with that, but anyway, it joined the common currency. And it was part of what we would call the hardcore of European integration. When the economic crisis came, it started dealing, it affected everyone. It affected Germans, France, but it affected more the economies of the periphery, because the economies of the periphery were the weaker economies. The weaker economic systems and the weaker economies. And the crisis brought to the forefront the problems of not only the economic system of Greece, but also of the political foundations of the economic system in the country. I have already explained to you some of the issues that we still have, I would say, in Greece. Does anyone know what we mean by the term South European capitalism? It's present in Italy. There are Italians here, right? It's very much present in Italy. Do you understand what that means?
Maybe capitalism that suffers from corruption, clientelism and stuff like that. That is like a problem in this region.
It is corruption, but also Southern European capitalism is not that, there is corruption, but
not a fully developed capitalism and a lot of intervention by the state.
State intervention. Capitalism in theory is free. It's not involved. In fact, capitalism in Southern Europe was very much affected by the state. Big companies had special relations with the state for procurement. Fiat, to give you an example, all in the 1980s and up till the 1990s, all the state purchases of state cars in Italy were Fiat. If you bothered to buy a Volvo or a BMW for official purposes, that would create a mess. So capitalism was very much linked to the state. Because it was linked to the state, it created clientelism, a relationship of dependence. It created patronage. It created corruption. So there was a weak economy, a weak independent economy. I also explained to you that we had conflictual bad relations, meaning that it was difficult to achieve consensus over issues, such as the role of trade unions, to give an example, or the liberalization of certain sectors. So these, let's say, problems that existed in the economic system of Greece were hidden because Greece was a successful economy at the time of a successful global economy. everybody advanced, Greeks advanced better than the rest. As a matter of fact, before the crisis, the Greek GDP was increasing higher than the average GDP of the European, of the Eurozone. Greece had a very weak civil society. Everything, even today, everything passes from the state. The state does not allow, or did not allow, let's speak in the past tense, did not allow the rise of social groups without some form of relationship with political parties. And as a result, government, and thus the state, was present in every activity of Greece. And vice versa. Every activity of Greece was affecting government decisions. So you had a civil society that was extremely weak and a political system that had to take into account all the various interests that existed at play at the same time. Now, that made, as I told you, Greece was going very well in the first decade of 2010, but the problems that existed in the Greek economy did not go away. Most of the Greek growth was due to consumption. It was not due to productivity. The business sector was not competitive because to a large extent it had to comply with very difficult and very obtuse regulations, and at the same time because the dysfunctions of the Greek system which pre-existed the crisis were not dealt with. So there was an increasing deficit. Nobody paid attention to the deficit. The deficit led to an increasing debt. Debt was financed by higher borrowing. Greece could borrow because it was a Eurozone member, and for international lenders, lending to Greece and lending to Germany provided the same level of security or danger. So it was an easy process to increase our borrowing, thinking, as it was the case at the time, that better days are coming and therefore we borrow, we produce wealth, we reimburse our debt, and we borrow more. That was the feeling, not only in Greece, that was the feeling in Europe between 2002, 2003 and 2008. Because we were living, you know, that the economies, the world level, the economies passed through sort of waves. The first period of the Eurozone was an uphill wave, was a bonanza period. And for this reason, everybody was happy. So nobody bothered about borrowing. Because, you know, there is money. Money will come back. Now, and that came to an abrupt end with the crisis. The crisis affected everyone. Affected Irish. It affected Portugal. It affected Spain. In most countries, it affected the economy because of one weakness. In Ireland, it was excessive borrowing of individuals. In Spain, it was an exposure of the banks. In Italy, it was it was a high deficit. In Greece, it was practically everything. And for this reason, the impact of the crisis in Greece was extremely harmful. I don't think that this is important, but you have to understand how Greece managed to have a global problem of economy. State spending. The state was increasing its spending. The crisis had fiscal costs. The economic crisis had direct fiscal costs. Fiscal costs. It reduced the entries for the government, for the state. Recession meant that Greek products abroad sold less. And as in most other European states, there was a rise in the prices of property, which exploded at some point in 2010. All that led to the explosion of an economic crisis that was unseen before, and especially that was not foreseen in the treaties. Now, I don't know how much you know about the monetary union, but what is essential to understand is that you may know from history of integration that economic and monetary union, as everything in Europe, was a process of give and take. What was given was the common currency. What was taken was the independence of states to devaluate and to increase their spending. The Germans accepted the common currency on condition that they would not be responsible for the debt of other member states. As a result, European economic and monetary union was mostly monetary because there was no real economic element in union. The economies were still managed at national level. So, to give you what we mean by the term economic policies. What do you understand by the term economic policies? Which were there at national level. Give me some examples of economic policies. Price stability is not economic, it's monetary. Taxation. Other. Capital investments. That's not economic, I mean that's social policy. But public spending, where your spending goes, which direction will spending go? Salary policies, how much do we increase salaries? These are economic policies. Instead, price stability, what is the value of your currency, moved from the national level and went to Frankfurt. The relations between the euro and the dollar was decided why in Frankfurt. What is in Frankfurt? The European Central Bank. So, monetary union was constructed, but economic union was not supposed to create a problem, and it remained at national level. To a large extent, the Maastricht Treaty was based on the assumption that gradually monetary integration will bring economic integration, And economic integration will bring political integration. That was not the case. And also, one important thing that nobody paid attention to in the beginning was the last sentence I have there. Do you understand what that means? How do you understand? The term bailout is extremely important in economic policy. What does it mean?
In case of a crisis, other European Union states won't help that member states which is battling crisis or debt or something.
That was the consequence, but what does it mean effectively, bailout? To give you an example, there are some Italians here? Yes. Okay, the regional government of Abruzzo, you are from Abruzzo? No. Okay, from Umbria. The regional government of Umbria decides to build a magnificent dam because there is a scarcity of water, and they build a dam. They get the money, and of course, like everything in Southern Europe, it costs more. And the government does not have, the regional government of Umbria does not have the money. What happens? It has promised the builder that you will get 1 million or whatever. But, there is no more money. What happens? Can they get a loan? Yeah, they get a loan in a way, but where do they get a loan from? From the state or from the central bank. Because when a regional government is in default, it goes to the government. And the government, the state government, is, well, not obliged, but by necessity will cover the debt of Umbria. This is a bailout. Because in a state, we have sort of the acceptance that Rome, or Athens, or Paris, will intervene if Napoli, or I don't know, Thessaloniki, or Marseille is in difficulty. This is basically the capacity of a higher level to intervene and cover the debt of a lower level. Now, the Germans specifically did not want to pay for the Italians. And for this reason, these are the specific countries. They didn't want to pay for the Greeks, but the Greeks were not significant, as I told you. It was Italy that was the case at the time. So Italy, the treaty had a provision saying that the European Central Bank is not allowed to buy debt of other member states. Do you understand what this means? Or let me rephrase the question. Do you understand how a state finances its debt? How does a state finance its debt? By borrowing. How? You don't go out and say, give me please 5 million euros. How does this happen?
It sells its own bonds.
Usually by issuing bonds. A bond is a promise of a debt. You understand what I mean? I issue a bond, 1,000 bonds, each of 1,000 euros, and I sell them out. And then I get 1 million, or 10 million. 1 million. I get 1 million, and this is debt. Now, the persons, usually it's not persons, it is banks. The individuals or the entities which hold the bond, they may come and claim that money. If you want to cancel this bond, you have two ways. One is that you pay it. A state can be in a good situation and say, okay, I buy my bonds, bring my bonds, and I give you the money. and they reduce the debt. Another one is that you find a friendly person who goes to the owner of the bond and says, okay, you have 5 bonds. Take 5,000 and give me the bonds. And puts them in a coffer somewhere. These bonds exist, but are not anymore claimable. So in theory, not in theory, in practice, you have reduced your debt. Central banks usually do that with regional governments. A regional government borrows, and the central bank of the United States, let's say, to go outside the Eurozone, when Louisiana borrows money, the federal bank will go to the banks that have the debt of Louisiana, and they will say, get 5 million dollars, and give me 5 million of Louisiana's debt. This is something that remains in the Fed, but at the same time, that's what is important to understand. Who is, how to put it, not responsible? Who is bearing the cost of that money that came from Louisiana? Which state? US, the federal state. So, the inhabitants of New York, of California, of Texas, of Florida. This is feasible in the United States because there is a stronger national identity, because it is a federal state, and as a result, no one complains about that. The same happens in Greece at national, in Europe at national level. The French state pays for the debt of Bordeaux, but the people in Paris do not claim revolt because they pay for Bordeaux, because there is solidarity. The Germans specifically, emphatically, did not want to pay for the Italians. They said the Italians can spend a lot of money, but this doesn't mean that this lot of money will have to be borne by the German taxpayers. And hence, they had the bailout cause. So, when the crisis appeared, Greece found itself in a situation where it was not able to pay its debts. Now, if Argentina, which is a real case, is not able to pay its debt, what is happening? They default. They don't pay, there is general havoc, Argentina is a pariah state, but they default. Argentinians have defaulted, I don't know, 7 or 8 times in their history. Then there is a renegotiation process, there is a devaluation process, the government falls, another government comes in. This is the usual process when you have monetary independence. It's not a good thing for Argentina, but it is something that can happen. Now, if you are in a Eurozone, which means if you are in a single currency, is it possible for a part of a single currency to default? It's not conceivable. Not only because you don't have a currency under which to default or to devaluate, but because monetary union implies a common market, freedom of movement, and therefore you cannot say that the Greek euros are no longer valid, because the Greek euros, I will take the Greek euros and move to France, and now they will be valid. So the concept of default at a single European currency is unthinkable. And in fact, nobody had thought about it. And suddenly, Greece says, I cannot pay my debt, and the other member states of the Eurozone they look at each other in order to find a way to deal with this unthought of situation. And to do this, they come to a very makeshift agreement, which is not a Eurozone agreement, but an agreement between Greece and each individual member state of the Eurozone, whereby Greece will get sufficient funding to pay its debt, its outstanding debt, and at the same time will undertake extremely harsh austerity measures to reduce, to annul its deficit. So basically, the concept, do you have to do a break? No, you don't have breaks. Okay. So basically, the idea behind this innovative, I don't know if the word innovative is correct because it was not very positive. This new concept was that member states of the Eurozone will lend Greece money to pay its debt, so Greece would not be in default, and Greece would undertake not to increase, to reduce its own deficit. This sounds, how does this sound for you, to you? Is this fair? What is fair in economy?
I mean, it can be fair, but it doesn't sound sustainable.
It doesn't sound, it could be sustainable if, how to put it, if the measures that were taken could be sustainable. The problem with the process, which is a process that did not affect only Greece, it affected Ireland, affected Portugal, partly Spain, and later on Cyprus, with different, as I told you, with different characteristics, but it was more or less the same concept. And Cyprus was also harsh because it had another element as well. The process denied very much the concept of solidarity that is inherent in building a common currency. You cannot have a common currency without having some level of solidarity. This doesn't mean that one pays for the other, especially one who is always the same pays for the other who is always the same. But it implies that there is a sort of common responsibility. Because to a large extent, and that is important to bear in mind, the Greek debt was provoked by excessive borrowing from German banks in order to buy German projects. Therefore, there were elements which required to be taken into account. But this implied a different conception, and I think that was also to some extent explained yesterday by Electra. It implies a different conception of the economic element of European integration. Because in some respect, the Greek case brought to the forefront the kind of Europe that we want to build. At some point, if you want to build an element of community, you need to have an element of solidarity, an element of common undertaking of debt. And this happened later on during COVID. We had the first expression of common debt with the borrowing to build the resilience and recovery and resilience fund. But in 2010, 2011, the fear was that the Greek case would expand and become a case of, how to put it, reckless Southerners who spend a lot of money and go to the hard-working northerners and ask for the money. And that was a stereotype that has affected gravely the process of European integration. On both sides, as a matter of fact. So, the crisis was seen in Greece as an abandonment by the European Union. And this affected very much the perception of Europe among the Greek population and among the Greek parties. For instance, it changed totally the party system in Greece. It created new dividing lines. There is no, in the past, Greece had the traditional dividing line between left and right, conservatives, liberals, conservative social democrats. The bailout agreement created a dividing line between those who said we have to keep working with Europeans to deal with the crisis, and those who supported that the system of the bailout that was promoted by the European partners was not sustainable and had to change. And this led also to the collapse of the traditional big parties, to the rise of protest parties on the left and on the right, on the extreme left and the extreme right, and also to a deficit in legitimacy, which was a legitimacy deficit not only vis-à-vis Greece, the Greek system, but also vis-à-vis, and in particular against the European partners. And it affected a lot how Greeks saw Europe, still affects how Greeks saw Europe. First of all, it led to a strong anti-German feeling. There it is. That is a cartoon that came in, that appeared in Greece in 2012, I think. It represents, is there anyone from Germany here? Yeah. Do you know who that is? Schäuble. Wolfgang Schäuble was the Minister of Economy. The Minister of Economy of the Federal Republic of Germany at the time. And the motto goes, negotiations started, and Schäuble, who is dressed as a Nazi military, underlines, we insist to have the soul from your Greece. We can discuss if we will use your ashes as fertilizer. So you see that for Greeks, or at least for this guy, I don't remember who that is, Germany was assimilated to Nazi Germany. A lot of issues from the Second World War came to the forefront and created, we still have, even now, 10 years after, 15 years after that, there still is a very strong anti-German feeling among the Greek population. And the other side was also, a stereotypical approach, Bild, which is the best-selling newspaper in Germany with 1 million readers, was selling, do sell, if you don't have money, sell your bloody islands and even the Acropolis. So you can see the impact of the crisis on the perceptions of Greeks and Germans, Europeans, regarding Greece. What time is it?
10 minutes left.
10 minutes left.
15, 10, 15.
15, okay. What is important to understand is that during this crisis, there was hardly any attempt for each side to understand its own mistakes. For the majority of Greeks, the crisis was conceived because the Europeans abandoned economic support of Greece, and for the majority of the European public and also the European leadership, it was a case of bad governance, and the Greeks voted to themselves. As I explained to you, to a large extent, the root causes of the crisis have to do with Greece, with the way the Greek political system and economic system was built, but to a large extent, the problems that appeared at the time of the crisis were linked to a large extent on the fact that the European monetary union was built in not solid foundations. An important thing that is useful to know is that the term reform in Greece, which was a mantra for the period of the crisis, Greece had to do reforms, came to be seen as a negative aspect. That for most Greeks, reforms meant austerity. Because when you talk about reforms, you mean cutting salaries, cutting pensions, reducing the funding for education. So whatever, even now, when people talk about reforms, there is a sort of inhibition, because it would probably lead to something negative. And also, these reforms, and that was another main problem for the Greek situation, these reforms were linked to a large extent to externally imposed reforms. There was no ownership. To give you an example, after 2015, as I explained to you, the political system collapsed, and we had new parties which arrived in power, and after 2015 we had a new government with a radical left party called Syriza, the coalition of the radical left. Now, the party came into power promising to cut austerity. It failed to do so. There were lots of issues at the time. You don't need to know about that. But in any case, after summer 2015, the government of Syriza accepted a new bailout agreement and imposed a number of new austerity measures. That was a government of the left. It accepted that, that's the balance of powers. It imposed very diligently the measures, but never acknowledged them. And that meant that measures were implemented, but all the ministers were saying, we don't like these measures, but we have to do that because we are forced to do that. And therefore, as a result, no reform, no change in policy could be seen by the citizens as positive by itself. Let me go a bit faster. At the same time that Greece was undergoing its crisis, more or less, from 2014 onwards, a second crisis came to overlap in the relationship between Greece and the European Union. I don't know how many of you know the refugee crisis I'm referring to in 2015-16. Some probably do remember. There was a mass, because of the civil war in Syria, and a significant millions of Syrians moved to the neighboring countries. In large part they stayed there, but gradually they started moving to Europe through Greece, eventually to Germany or Sweden, that was the usual. But they moved through Greece all along the Balkan route to Austria, to Germany. This created a crisis, a significant crisis in that's Syrian who arrives in one of the Greek islands. It brought to the forefront the fact that there was no effective asylum policy in the European Union, and that in fact Greece was left to deal with the European problem on its own. Again, bear in mind that I paint a situation which is moving, because 1 year after that, Europe is a slow mover. Because of the way decisions are taken, sudden events are not cannot be dealt, by one decision, by one prime minister. Usually they take long. In the in the concept of asylum, there were changes in the next year. But for Greeks, this came exactly at the time of the bleakest period of the economic crisis, and it added up to mistrust of Europe. That's what I want to underline. Now, after 2016, the government implemented austerity measures. Gradually, after 2017, the economy started to grow. In 2018, the country went again to the market, ceased to be under total control of the troika, of the lenders. And after 2019, there was a change in government, and the Conservative Party came to power. And Greece started becoming more normal, in a way. And that also changed a little bit, brought back the relations between Greece and the EU. But these relations continue to be affected by mistrust, despite the recovery and resilience fund. These are data from Eurobarometer, which is the level of trust in the institution of the European Union. If you see, Greece has the lowest level of trust after France, 37%. You see that to a large extent trust is linked to trust, that's interesting, trust is linked to trust in government or in institutions. When you trust your government and the institutions of your country, usually you also trust Europe, because you are satisfied in a way. When you don't trust your own institutions, usually you lack trust to Europe as well. These are the levels of trust throughout member states again. Now, one interesting thing is how Europeans and Greeks perceive European Union. I don't know if you can read. Does Europe conjure up very positive, fairly positive, neutral, fairly negative, or very negative? You see that the inner tie is Greece in both cases. So you see that trust, that's 2024, I think, the Eurobarometer of 2024. Trust in Greece is lower, and mistrust is higher than the average of the EU. And that was made before the European Parliament election, so the question refers to the European Parliament as well. Even the European Parliament, as you see, has lower level of trust than the average Europeans, and a higher level of mistrust. To a large extent, today, there is there remains a misunderstanding between Greeks. As a matter of fact, most Southern European countries now are economically better off, not better off, the advancement of the economy is better in the south than it is in the north. I mean, Germany and France are in the doldrums, and Italy is praised everywhere for the economic situation it has. But despite these changes, which do not affect very much perceptions, we can see that for Greeks, the European Union still does not bring forward the concept of solidarity. Greeks are egoistic people, and we want the others to be solidary with us. We don't necessarily show solidarity with others when this is the case. I mean, in other situations, but for the real problem with the relations between Greece and the EU is the absence of solidarity, which is still an ongoing question. In the refugee issues, as I told you, there have been advancements, but there still is a national, very much, and it becomes even more national now. There is a national view of the refugee question. To give you an example, refugees are the only people who are dealt at national level. Migrants in Europe have, how to put it, regional rights, the right to move. Recognized refugees have very limited regional rights. And this is an issue that nobody wants to address nowadays. Turkey is a permanent issue for Greece, which Europeans do not want to take into account, wisely so, as a matter of fact, but which also adds to the concept of lack of solidarity, or the perception of lack of solidarity. And again, the development of the Recovery and Resilience Fund is not such that can change perceptions. To a large extent, the Recovery and Resilience Fund was hailed as, a moment that would create common institutions to handle a common debt. That was not the case. Now that the Recovery and Resilience Fund comes to an end, for the majority of Greeks, it was another European project which did not really affect us, our lives in Belgium. And two last slides. I'm finishing, Chair. Do you see yourself as Greek only or national only? At the European level, that's 33%. At the Greek level, it's 42%. Greeks have a higher perception of being only Greek, and a very low perception of being Greek and European at the same time. European and Greek at the same time, so you see 1%. They are mostly feeling Greek and Europeans, but when they need to choose, they choose Greece. And that is also important in their view of Europe. And but you don't see, that is reasons for voting and non-voting. And one important difference, mostly when you ask voting, they lie, I always vote. More Greeks vote than Europeans. It's my duty as a citizen. Greeks say, I vote because I can make things change by voting in the European elections. 22% of Greeks think that. But 30% of Greeks vote to express disapproval of the government, which is much less than the the level that we have at European level. And for not voting, there is a lack of trust of politics. 37% of Greeks decided not to vote because they don't trust politics. And 9% because they are not interested in European affairs, lower than other member states. So to some extent, what I feel like to close my intervention is that Greece started from the wrong footing, if you want, with the European process, looking at it as an economic entity, as an economic process which led to a negative reaction when the economic benefits ceased to exist. And we need to reformulate our relations with the European process in order to transform it not so much into peace, but into prosperity and effectively into more solidarity. And that will require a rethinking about what European integration is. Thank you for your attention. I'm open to questions.
Questions, comments? We have 2 minutes, 1 minute and a half.
Only? I thought it was up till 2.
No, it was 90 minutes. Yes. Are there any comments or? Speak up, please. There is a mic, however.
I think I can just. If you think it was to land on the, let's say, period of time that shattered the most the Greece last in the EU, was the 2008 crisis.
Well, yeah, the economic crisis. The refugee crisis was important, but it was affecting a smaller number of persons directly, because it affected people who lived in the islands or people who had to, who were in the process of movement. On the other hand, the economic crisis affected everyone. But the refugee crisis added up because it was visible. I mean, you didn't feel it. I mean, if you live in, in a city in the southern Peloponnese, you didn't live it, but you saw it. I mean, you saw people walking. There were people who were walking, basically, the railway line to reach the borders of North Macedonia, walking for tens and hundreds of kilometers, things like that. But I think the economic crisis was much more important because it affected everyone.
I have a question for you. It's the same question I put every year, but he answered in different ways every year.
How do you remember?
No, I don't remember actually, but I know. So if you were to think at the contribution of Greece to the European integration and to the European Union, what would you mention?
The most important contribution would be the reorientation of the agricultural funding to the south, what we call Mediterranean integrated programs, because they were the first to bring to the forefront the special needs of the southern agriculture. That was required by Greeks. I mean, Italians intervened, but Italians were satisfied with the status quo, so they didn't particularly like it. But that is one thing. I could also speak about, to reply, after 2000, Greece was not seen as a valid player in international relations. In COVID, gradually it changes, but still is not important. But before that, the accession process of the Balkans was also very much led by a summit that took place in Thessaloniki in 2003, which opened the way to the accession process of the Balkans. It's not a big success because they're still in the accession process, but that is another aspect, the Balkan view. But most of that has ceased, because now Italy and Austria play a different, more important role in that. The economic weakening of Greece also led to the diplomatic weakening within the EU. And as I explained in the beginning of my lecture, we were not present.
I know.
The incapacity of the Greek leadership to understand the concept of supranational negotiation meant that Greeks in general were not apt to advance issues in a successful manner at European level, because they tried to deal with that in a Greek manner, take it or leave it. Greeks are very good. They are very good negotiators in private lives as traders, but they are not good in negotiating in international level, because they cannot conceive what is a red line for the other side and try to become what they call honest brokers. Did I answer?
I am satisfied.
You will remember that next year.
Yes, so
I know for everything, you know. Okay, so our time is over. Professor Papageorgiou, thank you very much.